One thing that I've mentioned before that I think is particularly important to understand about the art of ancient Egypt is that most art that comes down to us is funerary, and therefore it was not meant to be seen by living eyes. It was really meant for an audience of the dead. It was meant to accompany someone to the afterlife. And that's because most of what we have found has been found in massive tombs. It's very well preserved and survived because it was buried underground. Because the majority of the art that we study from Egypt is funerary in nature, it suggests that it was a death-obsessed culture. And this, I think, is a bit misleading because we can assume that art was made for other purposes as well, but this is what is best preserved and what we have to study. That being said, the art that we do have does imply that the idea of the afterlife and what happens after death was a central concern for ancient Egyptians. I'm showing you here an image of the god Anubis, who we met in the last lecture, preparing a person's mummified remains for the afterlife. The Ka was a life force, or the spirit of the deceased. And that Ka needed a place to inhabit, and therefore the body was preserved through the mummification process for the Ka to inhabit. The Aka was that part of the person that goes on to the afterlife and lives with the gods. We also find sculptures that inhabit these tombs, and they're often placed in tombs as a kind of backup in case something happened to the mummy. So it was sort of a secondary home for the Ka. These are all important ideas to understand because the body never is meant to die. It is meant to live on with the Ka. And this is why we see some very precise, ordered rituals that need to be followed in order for the person, for the deceased, to move on to their afterlife. The first funerary architecture we see in early Egypt was called a mastaba. And it's kind of a truncated pyramid with sloped sides and a flat top. The word mastaba means bench in Arabic, and you see it kind of does look like a bench. It's a rectangular brick or stone structure with sloping sides over an underground burial chamber that is accessed through a shaft. So here's the burial chamber, and this is the shaft that would be sealed off after the remains were put inside. So this is where the mummy would remain. The form probably developed from burial mounds and were first probably only for one person, but then they evolved to bury members of several families. The main features, aside from that burial chamber and shaft, are a chapel with a false door that would include a place for the living to make offerings to the dead. So, the living would be responsible for providing regular meals and things like that for the dead. It would also have a chamber for the statue of the deceased, and this would be kind of the backup home for the Ka. As you can see, mastabas would probably be in clusters in a necropolis or a city of the dead. This brings us to the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt, which ran from about 2575 to 2150 BCE. This is when mainstream Egyptian culture took over the entire kingdom. It was a period of political stability and an era in which there was expanding wealth of the pharaohs and their families. And the pharaohs and government officials were wealthy patrons of the arts. They would fund a necropolis for the dead, a city of the dead, and we see several of them. We're going to be looking first at Saqqara, which is where the first step pyramid is found, and then Giza, which is the home of the Great Pyramids. You'll notice that they are placed on the west side of the Nile because the setting sun would have been the appropriate place for a necropolis. In Saqqara, there's a large funerary complex that was built under the rule of Djoser. Djoser ruled from 2681 to 2662 BCE. And the Great Stepped Pyramid was designed by Djoser's prime minister, or the chancellor to the king, Imhotep. Imhotep designed this pyramid probably as a single-story mastaba, and then over time they decided to increase it in height to ultimately 200 feet high. You should remember Imhotep is known as the first named architect in history, and we know his name through the writings of Mentheo, remember the 3rd century BCE Egyptian priest that wrote about the dynasties of Egypt. Djoser placed his mortuary complex at the site of Saqqara, and this complex that he developed with Imhotep would impact all royal memorial monuments going forward. So this really becomes a prototype for pyramids. While the complex had lots of different innovations, among the most important are that it was the first mortuary structure to be built in stone, the first stepped pyramid instead of a single mastaba, and you can see how it is a mastaba, a large mastaba at the foundation with increasingly smaller mastabas piled on top. It was also the first complex to combine both mortuary and ritual buildings in the same place, and to pair these functional buildings with dummy ones or false ones that couldn't actually be used to fool grave robbers. If we look at this diagram of the step pyramid, we can see how it acts very much like the mastaba. The burial shaft extends down to a chamber where the mummified remains would be buried. There would also be a chapel that would include a place for people to leave objects, and a chamber inside for a sculpture of the deceased. This is a plan of the mortuary complex at Saqqara, and we see at the center is the step pyramid, as well as the mortuary chapel that is adjacent to it. Inside of the enclosure wall, we also see that it is surrounded by several courtyards, one of which is called a Heb court, or a Hebset court. And this is the place that during his lifetime, the pharaoh would perform several feats of strength or races or challenges, athletic challenges, to reassert his appropriateness as the ruler. These challenges would happen every 30 years, although some scholars say every 13, and they would again reassert his leadership, and he would be crowned again as the pharaoh. Now, when you go, we can see markers that represent the route that the pharaoh would have had to run during these said festivals, these festivals in which he would perform these challenges. But it gives you a sense also of the immense scale of the step pyramid and the example it set for later pyramids and rulers as they planned their tombs.